Chapter 10 starts with an awesome case study about the Green Belt movement. Definitely read this, understand that individuals can make a difference, and keep this in mind when we get to human population in our next unit as well. And we're considering, how can we help people in developing countries? What can we do to slow population growth? So 10.1, dealing with major threats to forest ecosystems. So one thing you have to know, when we talk about forests, we can talk about old growth forests and second growth forests. The only old growth forests in the United States are found in the Pacific Northwest and Alaska, pretty much. Everywhere else, including all over the eastern United States, trees were cut down in massive quantities by European settlers and through the 18th and into the 19th century for building materials and to clear land for agriculture, etc. So we don't have any old growth forests here. Book discusses tree plantations, something important to remember about tree plantations. So think about if you go and pick out a Christmas tree and all the trees look the same, monoculture, right? Lacks biodiversity. So economic services here outweigh ecological services. Definitely know the natural capital, ecological services and economic services that are presented on page 220. You need to be able to explain what that does. So why is storing atmospheric carbon beneficial for humans? Okay, because stores atmospheric carbon, that reduces the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which reduces the greenhouse effect, which is going to maintain temperatures at a reasonable level. So we aren't dealing with some of those nasty effects of climate change that we'll talk about later this year. For example, page 222, figure 10.6 and figure 10.7, we see some examples of logging. Know the advantages and disadvantages of each one. So selective cutting versus clear cutting, which is what we can see in that image 10.7, and then strip cutting, okay? They each have advantages and disadvantages. The advantages and disadvantages for clear cutting forests are presented in 10.8. In terms of fires, another threat to forests, some fires are okay. Surface fires, like that can be seen in the image on the left of figure 10.9, these can actually help to clear flammable material, and therefore it reduces the risk of a large fire, like we can see in the image on the right. Surface fires can also release seeds from adapted plants, so we see a lot of these in chaparral, for example. In some grasslands, there are some species that will only release seeds and only be able to reproduce when subjected to extreme heat. So some need fires. They can also help to control tree diseases and pests. So there are advantages to fires, but usually more those surface fires, not crown fires. In terms of some local threats to trees that we see here in New England, Dutch elm disease and the Asian longhorned beetle have had some very devastating effects on species of trees, and they're kind of making their way into this region more from down south. So that can be a problem. We have a positive feedback loop when it comes to forest fires. So as the temperature increases, that increases the amount of dry and dead trees, and that will increase the risk of fire. Fires increase the risk of increase the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and therefore that increases temperature more. Positive feedback. Deforestation, major threat to forests around the world. On page 225, they have some negative effects of deforestation. Deforestation does occur more often in less developed countries. That is important to keep in mind. So here, figure 10.2, you can see it's a satellite image, kind of heat-sensitive satellite image of Brazil. So on the left, you see 1992. 2006, you can see the roads that have led to an increase in habitat fragmentation and increased access to trees. So you can see all those areas where there are no trees anymore. The major causes of tropical deforestation, which remember tropical rainforests have huge amounts of biodiversity and net primary productivity, but it varies depending on what tropical rainforest we're talking about. The Amazon in South America, it's mostly for cattle grazing, soybean plantations, and then hardwood lumber. There's a demand for that in developed countries such as the United States. In Southeast Asia, the major cause is palm oil plantations, which will make you feel a little bit guilty about eating Nutella. I feel a little guilty every time because it has palm oil in it. In Africa, the major causes of deforestation are fuel and then small farms. So here we can see 10.14, major causes of deforestation. We have underlying causes such as poverty and population growth, and then direct causes. When we have, a lot of times forests will be burned because it's faster than removing it. A lot of times if they're clearing the land just for agriculture, they don't need the trees. So you burn tropical rainforest, that increases the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That's going to increase temperature. It's going to decrease rainfall. It's going to increase drought. You've got drier trees, and then those tropical rainforests are more likely to burn. So another positive feedback loop. And something also to keep in mind, a lot of tropical rainforests are cleared for crops. But if you remember back to chapter 7, tropical rainforest soil is not great. It's nutrient poor because of all of the nutrients being stored in the vegetation. So the soil can be really nutrient poor and then not that great for crops. So there are some solutions for how we can actually prevent all of these things from happening. So we can see those on page 230. And being able to certify that your, lumber is actually done or harvested in a sustainable way. There's a process to do that now, which is pretty awesome. In terms of preventing forest fires or reducing harm from forest fires, many places use prescribed or controlled burns. There's the Let It Burn policy, which was adopted by the U.S. Forest Service for a while, much to the chagrin of some people. Can protect houses by thinning the brush and small trees nearby. And then if you thin out small and fire-prone trees, that could be helpful as well. Now, in the United States, 60% of wood that is consumed is unnecessarily wasted. Junk mail. Think about the amount of junk mail you get. That's something, excess packaging, etc. So next time you check your mail and you get an Amazon delivery and 3 things of junk mail, that's all unnecessarily wasted wood. Okay. In the United States, in developing countries, not the United States, 3/4, 75% of harvested wood is used for fuel. Okay. So that's why poverty can be a root cause or an underlying cause of deforestation. So there are some good solutions to reduce deforestation and also indoor air pollution on page 232, like solar cookers, yay, and using things other than wood. And then on page 233, we have a summary of the solutions divided up into prevention and restoration. Prevention is always better because keeping things as they are. Restoration, though, can certainly help to restore those environments. 10.3 gets into grasslands, another ecosystem that is under threat. One of the major causes of loss of grasslands, is overgrazing. So basically the grazing animals exceed their carrying capacity. They damage the grasses, they damage the roots, they're trampling. So your grass cover is reduced, that soil erosion is increased, soil compaction occurs, and then grass just can't grow anymore. This can lead to desertification. Term here, which you may not be familiar with, riparian zone. These are areas along streams where you have vegetation that's growing, so maybe it looks different from further away from the stream. So these are really important habitats for wildlife. And then chapter 10, we'd get into how lands can be managed. The biggest threat to our national and state parks in the U.S. is their popularity. So with all of those people coming in, you get more soil compaction, air pollution, noise pollution, wildlife disruption, etc. We get page 238 case study that looks at the reintroduction of the wolves in Yellowstone, which we have talked about as a trophic cascade. And then we get into different nature reserves, the idea of connecting them, buffer zones and corridors, so you don't get these islands that can reduce the amount of biodiversity. Costa Rica, as we've mentioned before, is a great example of a country that has taken their natural capital and really turned it around to be an economic gain, and they've helped protect their biodiversity. In terms of like U.S. lands, from most to least protected, the most protected are wilderness areas, then national parks, then wildlife refuges, then national resource lands, and finally national forests. So in a wilderness area, pretty much nothing can happen, right? It's supposed to be as untouched as possible. People can walk through, etc., but no human activities. Whereas national forests, you might have mining and logging and roads and hotels, etc. Okay, still protecting the land, but not to the same extent. And then in terms of biodiversity hotspots, which we can see here in figure 10.5, biodiversity hotspots represent 2% of the land surface, but contain 50% of flowering plant species and 42% of terrestrial vertebrates. So many people argue that if we have to focus on certain areas, let's focus on these biodiversity hotspots. And of course, when we're trying to protect areas, you need to have the cooperation or the buy-in of local residents as well for these conservation and restoration projects to work. Because if you don't, then it's just outside people coming in and telling people what to do. So that's why that Greenbelt movement worked really well. And then we have some examples here. At the end, here with like reconciliation ecology. I don't know that that'll show up on the exam, but it's still interesting to read.